And then, days later, he is back, sitting as he hadn't for months, in an ordinary chair, as though it were ordinary this evening, as if the box of emptiness could again snap shut. I laugh with relief. Now I can finally tell you. I begin, and just as quickly, he's gone. Hands at checks, he dissolves into Munch's wail, a sketch in white and gray apparition. You are crying. You are no longer my father, and I am no longer your child. Your mouth twist, your horror at dying, made plain to me. I am told, no, you do not grieve. No, you feel no loss because you feel nothing. They tell me God will comfort, filled with grace, all wounds. Is it not true? Here is the chair, the night, the ordinary light streaming over our faces. When you appear to me like this, morphing, shapeshifter, grieved by your own dying, I feel the weight of the words unspoken, the questions no one answered for you, the doctors, the nurses, the holy man, we children scattered moonshot clouds, visible to the eye, but nothing to the touch. Healing Effects of After-Death Communication, a poem by Dilruba Ahmed in her collection of poems, Bring Now the Angels, published by Pitt Series. Good evening and welcome to Philly Loves Poetry, a collaborative program between the Moonstone Art Center of Philadelphia and PhillyCam. The mission of our program, as always, is to give our viewers and our listeners the rich experience of poetry in the city of Philadelphia, and to understand that in Philadelphia we have many treasured poets and a lot of treasured poets, really unequaled anywhere in the United States. I would even say anywhere in the world. And tonight we have one of those treasures as our guest. And I mentioned her name before, Dilruba Ahmed. She likes to be called Ruba, and that's what I will call her. Ruba is the author of Bring Now the Angels, Pitt Series Poetry Series, published in 2020, with poems featured in New York Times Magazine, the Best American Poetry 2019, and podcasts such as Slowdown and Poetry Unbound. Ruba's debut book of poetry, Dhaka Dust, was published by Graywolf Press in 2011 and won the Bakeless Prize. Her poems have appeared in Kenyon Review, New England Review, and Ploughshares. Ruba is part of a low-resident MFA faculty at Warren Wilson College's MFA program for writers and Chatham University's MFA program. Ruba also teaches with Hugo House and the Writing Lab. So welcome, Ruba. We're really honored and glad to finally have you on our program.
Thank you so much, Charles. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So I wanted to start off, our discussion phase of the program by quoting something that you gave in an interview to Justin Vigos. I think it was in the New England Review, and I'll quote it. You say, in my poems, I also hope that part of what emerges is a longing for the seemingly unattainable, for home and a homeland, for permanence, for language, for a family undivided by time and geography. So could you share with us and explain perhaps in more detail as it relates to you as a poet, a teacher, a citizen, if in fact you have found the homeland, and is that homeland your poetry?
It's a great question, Charles. Thank you. And thanks again for inviting me to be part of the show. I'm really grateful for your hosting me, and grateful to Larry Robin at Moonstone for sponsoring the program, and of course, all the staff at PhillyCam. The question of homeland was definitely central to my first book, and continues to be a question that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And that's, as someone who is from a family of immigrants. My parents came here from Bangladesh in the late 60s, early 70s. And, as someone who was growing up in small towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania, many times the only person of color, in the classroom, there were many times when I felt like I wasn't sure where I fit in. And so I think that search for a homeland, I've come to see as a process more than sort of arriving at a destination. And in many ways, part of that has been coming to see culture as not just something that we're subject to, but also something that we contribute to. And so, I think I've grown from feeling unanchored, maybe unmoored, to feeling grateful that I have this chance to kind of straddle more than one world and to shape, what it is that I want to carry on from the various traditions that are part of my family's heritage.
Yeah, and so a lot came from your mother and a tradition of poetry in Bangladesh, and you talked about that, briefly, as an inspiration and as a, kind of the framework for you. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. My mother, when she was young in Bangladesh, was deeply involved in the sport of poetry recitation, which is a competitive sport in Bangladesh. Poetry is very much part of the fabric of Bangladeshi culture. And so, it's not, poetry isn't something that's just for the educated or the elite classes. It's really something that people and from all walks of life enjoy. And, I think it's fair to say that everyone there has a poem or two committed to memory. And so it's very much celebrated and very much part of a rich tradition of literature in that part of the world. And so when I was growing up, I would, hear stories of my mother's participation in these poetry recitation competitions. And she would continue, reciting and rehearsing many of the pieces when I was growing up. So I would actually hear her reciting those pieces. And much of the Bangla poetry that she was reciting is written in the formal form of Bangla, as opposed to the sort of everyday Bangla that's spoken in the household or with friends. And so there was this sense of understanding the words, but also not fully understanding the meaning of the poem. And I think in many ways, that experience of hearing her recite poems in which I could catch some words, but not all of them, but I could still catch the beauty of the language, the sound of it, and the music of it. I think those experiences had a big impact on me in terms of how I think about language. It was something very musical and very mysterious.
So you really have a DNA of poetry, obviously. There was, turning to your book, Bring Home Now the Angels, there was one, and it's sad to say, there was one short line in a poem, and I'm not remembering what it was, but it said, "He is a wound I cannot touch." And after I read that, I thought of, I looked at, the book and the poems, because I've read the book twice, and I thought of a book of biology, or like I had in high school and even in college, of, remember you had these transparencies, and when they wanted to reveal different parts of the body or different parts of let's say, a vascular system, you could turn it. And there were layers and layers and layers, and to help you understand. And I really got that impression as I read your book of poems, of this layering, and as you moved on across both sections of your book. And so, I mean, is that a valid observation? And can you talk about that process of I'll call a layering or a building, the way you've built these poems?
I love this analogy, and I really appreciate it. I think that, I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of these, the textbooks that show layer upon layer of the skeletal system, the nervous system, the muscular system. And I think for me, when I was writing this book, part of what I was doing was really trying to dig. And sometimes I needed different approaches to dig into material that was very difficult to approach. And so there are, on the one hand, I was trying to approach the material in a lot of different ways, because it was sort of difficult to get at the heart of it. And at the same time, I was also intentionally thinking about layers in the revision phase and thinking about the contexts in which, the scenarios or situations were situated. So I think that's a great analogy for, it's one I really appreciate for thinking about how these poems sort of move through the world.
Mm-hmm. So, the first part of your book, and I'll talk about two parts in the great. But the first part of your book, of course, is about coming to grips and the grief and the observations of your father dying. And so I just throw in, I had to watch my father die over 8 years from different strokes, but I never wrote about it. I always wrote about, I guess the good things. But I mean, your poems are so intense, and once again, coming back to the layering. But I say to myself, how do you approach writing about that? I mean, do you journal it as it's going and say, or is it all retrospect about how different things happened along the way, not only to your father, but how he experienced America and the American, I'll call it the medical industrial complex in the treatment, in his treatment. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, some losses are losses that stay with us. And I think part of the challenge for me was that this was the first family member I had lost. It's such a big family, but they're spread out all across the world. And many of them are back home in Bangladesh. And so this loss came as a great shock. And I think that there's a line in the same poem that you quoted that says, "I look because I cannot turn away." And so I feel like that was kind of the impulse here with these poems, where initially, I didn't actually write about the illness. When my dad was sick, I was working on other things, and I had a real resistance to writing about my father's illness, all the things that we were seeing sort of from the inside in the medical system and his treatment there. And it wasn't until about a year after he passed away that something in me just dissolved, and suddenly the poems came in a flood. So, I think I was kind of skirting the issue. I wasn't getting to the heart of what I really needed or wanted to write about, and it was really kind of evading difficult content, because it's hard. It's challenging to
Mm-hmm.
write about something that's
Mm-hmm.
so intense and overwhelming, and came as a real shock to my family. So I'm not sure exactly what happened in that year, that first year after his loss, but about a year out from his death, I had, continued writing, and suddenly many of the poems that made up this book came, just sort of came in a flood. And that's when I realized, that there had been walls inside that, I was certainly aware of, but I didn't know when they would come down and how they would come down, but they did. But I definitely have this sense, you mentioned thinking about these other parts of his life that, maybe have written out in some ways. I think part of what was surprising to me is that I did feel a sense of completion when the book, came together. I've come to see grieving, it's not having a kind of conclusion, but I felt like a phase of the grieving was certainly, had passed. But I also definitely feel the stirrings of future work to come that's related to his life, as you mentioned, sort of like the early days of his life. He and my mom lived here in Philadelphia, and there's so many stories that I have that we have as a family.
Sure.
And so, if I'm walking around the campus of the University of Pennsylvania, there are multitude of stories there that I haven't written about. So I think those are in the poems to come.
Well, you answered the one question about, does this work bring you to a certain place with grief? Not that letting it go, but there's not a resolution, but it's a certain stage, in the grief process, and it must give you a lot of strength. The other thing about when I'm talking about the layering, the building of all your poems, not just about your father's death, is the different styles of poetry that you employ for different poems. You do use the ghazal, and you can explain to our audience what that is. I mean, it's really from the background of, Arabic culture and Persia, and it's a very powerful tool, and you can explain it. But I found it fascinating how you wove that, and then you have prose like poems, and then you have more free verse, and then you have the poem like I read, and even your signature poem, where there's the poem on the page is spaced in such a way that you're saying to the reader, you have to read it like this. You have to take a breath to almost digest these words, and it is so helpful. And you teach somebody, well, this is why there is style. This is why a poem is on a page in a certain way. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking of this quote by Marie Howe, in which she says that every poem is a cup of silence. Every poem holds at its center a deep silence around what can't be explained and what's unsayable. And I think for me, the process of writing about grief and about the mourning process was very much about trying to get at something that couldn't be said. And so, I think part of what you're observing in the book is that I was really trying to get at that silence in many different ways. And so, the other factor was that the material was so difficult to grapple with, and it was the material I kept coming back to over and over again. And so, what I found is that by working, sometimes the formal aspects of poetry were the parts that gave me a little bit of distance from the work, so that I could find a way in and could speak to some emotional truth. So the ghazal, for example, which I'm sure many people know, is an ancient Persian form that has many strict parameters. So there's a couplet structure, there's a strict rhyme and refrain scheme. I think for me, having those kind of constraints in place serve as a kind of many times as a kind of productive distraction, so that my mind's preoccupied with, how do I make this rhyme and refrain pattern work out? And then what happens in the meantime is that I get a different access point to the material, so that I might be able to utter a truth in a way that might not have come otherwise.
Yeah, really the genius of those poems I've read is that diversity of style. Usually when someone picks up a book of poems, no matter who it is, there is a certain structure that is not predictable, but it's continuous. Some people write in quatrains and tercets, and some people do couplets. And so they have a way of presenting on the page. To see that kind of diversity, I mean, really, for someone that might not be a poet, to say, "Wow, this is a different way that you can, that you can construct a poem." And so I think it's really helpful for people to see, hey, the landscape of poetry is pretty wide. What you can do to be able to tell your poem, present your poem in that way. Of course, the book in itself is two parts, and I think people would be led to believe, okay, part one is about your dealing and grappling with the death of your dad, and part two is about your experience with America and the sociocultural. However, going back to my example of the layering, myself, I saw the two connected. I did, and maybe some other people won't, because I saw a continuation of grief. of suffering, of sorrow, but in the context of our culture and our society, the greater America. And it's the current existential predicament, but it seems to be a larger picture even than today. So, can we talk about that? Can you talk about that? How you, wove those two together and what your purpose was?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're absolutely right. The first half of the book does deal largely with my father's 3-year battle with multiple myeloma and then his loss. And then the second half of the book also deals with the loss. It continues that theme of loss, but the loss broadens out from the personal into more public forms of loss, and different contexts, different people, different scenarios. And it may be that part of the layering, sensation that you're getting has to do with the lens I used or tried to use when I was revising these poems, which was to try to think about, how to push some of the poems at least out of the autobiographical moment. So, so many of these stories are deeply personal, and yet I know that my family and I were not alone in having had this experience of, moving through the machine of Western medicine, right, which both saved my father, but also in many ways also destroyed him. And so, navigating insurance, treatment, maltreatment, quality of treatment issues around dialysis. Uh, so many of those things are not unique to our experience. And so, as I was revising, in some of these poems, I really looked for windows of opportunity where I could push out of that autobiographical moment and think about how the poem could gesture outward a little bit more, even though these experiences were so deeply personal. And so, part of what I tried to keep on the table through the revision phase was a speech that Claudia Rankine gave some years back at AWP, in which she urged white writers to stop erasing race from their poems. And though she was speaking, sort of directly to white writers, from where I'm standing as a writer of color, there's certainly more work to be done. So the way I tried to bring that conversation into my work was to ask myself, who's speaking in these poems and who's not, or who's present, who's sort of represented and who isn't. And then I also tried to think about, what are the contexts? What are the cultural contexts, political, historical, social contexts that are underpinning all of these situations? And are there ways that I should be bringing some of that into the poem? Are there ways to do that would be meaningful to the work? So that was very much on the table when I was going through the revision phase with some of these poems, which might speak to that, sort of layering effect that you're referring to.
So, in approaching, let's say the political, do you have a certain theory or philosophy about how it's done? In other words, you're not selling. I don't feel that you're selling something in these poems. You're just sharing and observing. For example, in one poem I read, "Remain," which was pretty powerful. You're just sharing that, but you're making a wider statement about the environment and about contamination, etc. But do you have a specific philosophy of this is how you and perhaps poetry needs to approach political without being too overly political?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think for me, part of what I became interested in, especially when I was thinking about work that was politicized, was this notion of indirect communication that W.H. Auden had. So, he had this idea, this thought that art couldn't bring people to faith. They couldn't bring people to God, that art couldn't do that, but that art could show people their despair. And so, sometimes in these poems, I was aiming for that kind of indirect communication, so that it wasn't, so much a call to do something, but rather a way to shed light on something, with the hopes that someone might feel compelled to action or might feel compelled to move, but that the work of the poem was really to shed light, to illuminate something that was maybe in darkness or had been silenced. So, I think this question of what's the role of the political and poetry has been on everyone's minds for many years, but very much so in the last 4 years. And I think for me, I like to think of that initial phase of writing as very sacred, that anything can come out on the page and to sort of honor that. But in the revision phase, I really do try to think hard about how does this poem, how's it going to move through the world? And I think that's where Claudia Rankine's questions come in to play in terms of thinking about, what kind of role do I want this poem to have in the world? What kind of contribution do I want it to make? So that's kind of how I've gone about thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned about in Bangladesh and how poetry was treated and how it was elevated. And, I also think of, Russia, at one time when they had, when the Yevchenko would read poems in front of 40,000 people, or in Latin America, Neruda in a soccer stadium. Surely that does not happen in the United States. And I don't know whether it would. I guess my point is, are we going to get to that point where poetry can be elevated to that level? And I don't know how, that's done, or if it was ever done. Maybe it's not in our blood, meaning in the United States, to be that way, to elevate poetry to that level. So many people say to you, and they surely say to you, and they say to me, and they say to different people, well, I don't quite understand poetry. But, if you picked up your book, poetry is very understandable, very readable, very accessible. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. I do think that there is this notion in American culture that, poetry is sort of lofty and it's difficult to understand, and many people get turned away because of the way it's taught in school, and it's too opaque and they feel left out. Hopefully that's changing. I think that there's such an amazing diversity of writing going on now that that's not just from writers from diverse backgrounds, but also aesthetically diverse, within all of those groups. And so my hope is that teachers are finding ways to bring writing into the classroom in ways that will resonate with students instead of scaring them away or boring them. But I do think that I also think that spoken word has done amazing, had an amazing contribution to the American literary scene and the American appreciation for poetry, because I think many times people can, respond in different ways to work that's being read out loud or performed out loud, and might find access points that are, easier entries into the work that are more accessible for them. And so hopefully, seeing Amanda Gordon reading at these venues where poetry isn't usually read, maybe it's the beginning of something really exciting for American culture.
So you're a teacher, so you're dealing with the current generation. Before we go to your reading your poems, can you just give us a capsule of what you feel is coming out of this generation that you're really teaching poetry to?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's been some time since I've taught undergrads. I've mostly been working with graduate students and adult students. And what I'm seeing now is a real desire to respond to, in many different ways, to Claudia Rankine's call to stop erasing race. And so, many of the white writers that I work with are asking, who can we look to figure out how to write about race in ways that aren't offensive, but are authentic and that go deep, that aren't superficial and are honest. These are great questions that many of the students I've been working with are asking. So that's been an exciting thing to think about together with them.
Right. Well, this has been a great discussion, but many people want to hear you read your poems, me included. So would you share a reading of your poems now, and maybe discuss, introduce them whatever way you want to.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Yeah, I'd be delighted to share some poems. I have about 8 or 9 poems to read, depending on time here. And I'll start with 4 poems that are from the first half of the book. So the first half of the book deals largely with my mother's battle with a form of blood cancer. And this first one is a poem that actually came about um, after after Trump was voted into office, and I was thinking a lot about the idea of forgiveness. You know, sort of when and whether it's possible. What might be, required for real empathy and compassion to take place. And while that idea of forgiveness still remains, the question of it remains unresolved for me still. I became interested in the meantime in the idea of self forgiveness as a precursor to our forgiveness toward other people. And so this poem came out of that. It's called Phase One. For leaving the fridge open last night, I forgive you. For conjuring white curtains instead of living your life. For the seedlings that wilt now in tiny pots, I forgive you. For saying no first, but yes as an afterthought. I forgive you for hideous visions after childbirth brought on by loss of sleep. And when the baby woke repeatedly for your silent rebuke in the dark, what's your beef? I forgive you for letting vines overtake the garden, for fearing your own propensity to love, for losing again your bag en route from San Francisco, for the equally heedless drive back on the caffeine-fueled return. I forgive you for leaving windows open in rain and soaking library books again, for putting forth only revisions of yourself with punctuation worked over instead of the disordered truth. I forgive you. For singing mostly when the shower drowns your voice, for so admiring the drummer you failed to hear the drum. In forgotten tin cans may forgiveness gather, pooling in gutters, gushing from pipes, a great steady rain of olives from branches, relieved of cruelty and petty meanness. With it, a flurry of wings, 13 gray pigeons, ointment reserved for healers and prophets. I forgive you. I forgive you for feeling awkward and nervous without reason, for bearing Keats's empty vessel with such calm you worried you had perhaps no moral center at all, for treating your mother with contempt when she deserved compassion. I forgive you. I forgive you. I forgive you. For growing a capacity for love that is great, but matched only, perhaps, by your loneliness. For being unable to forgive yourself first, so you could then forgive others, and at last find a way to become the love that you want in this world. This next poem is related to some childhood experiences in my family of often going out for picnics together in parks. And there was a time when we were carrying on that tradition after my father's death, and I felt his presence very acutely, very keenly while we were in the park. It's called The Feast. My father is hosting the final picnic. He rolls a melon back and forth on the slate table to steady it and slice, each piece bleeding onto a white plate. The coals turn gray but still flicker and burn, with raw meat slung on top of the grill, oozing blood red to clear. In the river bordering the grove, a lone man paddles his arms, stomach pressed to a blue surfboard. Black and white ripples radiate from him while boats knock against the pier. The children gather their frisbees from grass, their volleyballs and rackets, appearing and disappearing in bright shirts like confetti. Their voices rise and fall. It is late. The sun shines, but not for much longer. The golden hour has begun. For a moment, the moss-covered trees glow lime green, frozen in their looming heights. My father, white shirt, gray pants, silver wristwatch, glasses. He always cut the melon. The plates are ready, the food is hot, the watermelon cold and seedless, and our lives, for a moment, are an untouched meal, perishable and delicious, one we've barely begun to taste. This next poem is the poem from which I've taken the title for the book, and this one is a poem that underwent heavy revision, and in its earlier stages was really very much focused on my father's and my family's, sort of individual experience of grappling with my father's illness. But in the later stages, I tried to make the voice here less singular and more choral, more plural. It's called Bring Now the Angels. Bring now the angels to test your pulse as you sleep. Bring the healer, the howler, the listening ear. Bring an apothecary to mix the tincture. We need the salve, the tablet, the capsule of the hour. Bring sword eaters and those who will swallow fire. Fetch the guardian to flatten the wheelchair, to hoist it toward heaven. The public shuttle awaits the ceaseless trips to the clinic. To the bedside manner, summon witness. This medic's disdain toward patients, the physician's dismissal of pain. And call the druggist again to drug us senseless. Bring a nomad to index our debts. Tuck each invoice into broken walls of regret. Call the cleric, the clerk, the messengers divine. Summon someone. Collect the prayers, buried or burnt, tied to stones, sunken seas, dunked underwater until all dissolves. Bring now the scribe. Let it be written. There is no shepherd, no Sherpa, no moonlight guide for these, the darkest journeys of our lives. Who will lift the shuttle above the outposts of the living? Who will watch it rise and rise? Who will clear a path among all the wreckage? Who will weave a nest for all the birds of passage? Who will bridge the gap between savage and salvage? Who will sing over wilting stalks, rough husks, silk still gleaming like hair in a dream?
Wow.
And this is the final section in the first half. It's called At Sunrise. First glint of sun at horizon, it happened upon me. Day creeping from darkness to blue dawn, the slow emergence of thought. I remember days my father was alive. I woke early with my sisters and washed in the cold. Religion, a destination, 2 hours toward the city, silent commute, as though calendars could occasion faith twice yearly, and yet I didn't mind. My mother's sunflowers nodding along the drive as we departed. My mother wrapping her shari, wrapping her shawl, wrapping us in belief's gauze. Dark morning, sky, time of prayer, time of contemplation, of the silence before speech. Cool as a slate, as impartial a God, a shadow of possibility. My friend believes in no God, but I cannot say what rises from mist when a body disappears into the unforgiving ground. The ablutions, the time wasted, the boulder of regret. I repeat words uttered when others hear of the loss of my father. I'm sorry, sorry, sorry. Kneeling now, stranger, prayer, no mosque, temple, church, and yet how awkward, what comfort to pray. These next few poems come from the second half of the book, so the themes do broaden out to more public kinds of loss. And these first two I wrote in response to, hearing about the Trump administration's brutal separation of families at our border. The first one is called "The Children." How each one is taken with care from car to school doorstep, each one hand in hand with an adult. How the mothers and fathers kiss their foreheads, first pushing aside their bangs or smoothing a stray wisp. One parent straightens her daughter's velvet headband, another wipes dried oatmeal from his son's pink lips. How carefully each child is guided around the bumpers of cars. How some turn to wave goodbye one last time, while others, drawn to friends by an invisible cord, move together, first left, then right, with the synchronicity of fish. How even the child with tears in his lashes, who cowers near a teacher, knows that in a matter of hours, a loved one will return to return him to the facts of home. Butterfly net for trapping monarchs, foil blanket from Space Museum, four-leaf clover charms on a chain. And another one in a similar vein. This one's called Appella. This morning, a light so full, so complete, we might ask why the god of sun is also god of plague, why the god of healing also god of archery. The children under trees, unaware their hearts have become targets red and inflamed as the eyes of men in thrones, find sticks in the grass to fashion into guns. Some brandish a branch saber. They are sniping the golden light with squinting faces. And everywhere they do not look, fences and more fences. There are no arrows to point the way as they scythe through woods or dart between cars in parking lots. The miles of fence links grow more and more impassable, even as the children try to follow the voices calling them now, at first with tenderness and then with fierce intensity. This section of the book also contains some poems that deal with various kinds of corruption. So I'll read a couple of those. This one is called "The Process." So grateful the process is clean and faithful, does not cheat like a disenchanted spouse dozing on a haggard couch. Take heart, the process is always right, is automatic, phlegmatic, clean, cold, and always refreshing, brewed to perfection, some say, guaranteed to satisfy, you might say. Give thanks the process is organized, synchronized and sterilized, optimized but not disguised, like the grown man at my door long after trick-or-treaters have gone, hand outstretched, mask covering his eyes. Thankful too for the oversight. No boogeyman standing over the drain pipe, clogging it with debris when no one sees, so he can charge you your life for the cleaning. Name your price. And how shall we praise the instruments of investigation, so shiny, so new, gleaming with silver and glass? No traces of fingerprints or funders, no whispered voices softly requesting of the results a first glance. There's no need to come clean. We know the process won't fall prey to steak and wine and then slink upstairs to spend some time, just a little. The process doesn't. The process wouldn't. The process isn't that kind. This next poem, someone was asking me the other day about the role of fable in my work, and I hadn't realized just how many of these poems either incorporate fable or sort of touch on fable-like aspects. But this next one is I think the most apparent example, which is a retelling of the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. So there are two voices, a questioner and a respondent, and this one came about from my interest in, sort of thinking about the individual up against these sort of faceless giant entities, whether that's a governmental agency or a corporate institution. So this one, is really thinking about the individual up against a kind of faceless mega corporation. It's called Choke. Was there a beanstalk, a golden egg-laying hen? No, just a magic seed, a courtyard of crooked men. Was there a giant? There must always be a giant. In how many ways did the giant try to choke you? He did not attempt this with his bare hands. In how many ways did the giant try to choke you? He didn't choke me, he choked the competition, flooded the market with magic seeds. Was magic involved? How else could he ensure economic chokehold? How else the power to ban sales of nature's seeds? Was magic involved? How else could he choke off a normal trade flow? How else, in revitalization's name, a new world economy? What life were you doomed to live? Must there always be doom in the developing world? What life were you doomed to live? Lifetime poverty, I was told. How did you pay 1,000 for your first bag of seeds? Alone, 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 alone. Forgive me, my children, my wife, alone. How did you know the seeds were enchanted? They only grow once, my pockets emptied without end. And what of the pesticides? The giant implied the magic seed has little need. Save your rupees, save your children. What did the seeds grow? Nothing, every time. How many times did you try? Too many. Then I took my life. Who weeps now over the blighted fields? My wife, my children, my God, what could I do? How many witnessed you drinking the pesticide? On our first date, we secretly strolled and tossed scraps to birds. What did the giant say when you died? From his heights, will he notice the smell of blood? Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. Who'll pay the loans now that you're dead? Please tell the world what is happening here. And my final poem is a poem in 7 sections, and it takes inspiration from a childhood toy, which is the Viewmaster. And some of you probably remember the Viewmaster is a kind of chunky set of red binoculars. You put in a slide and you click through, and there are 7 slides or images. And apparently now there is a virtual reality version of this. So my poem takes inspiration from that. And those of you who have been to Pittsburgh know that in Pittsburgh there are giant one-ways, with 4 or 5 lanes, and one lane that's a counterflow lane for the public buses. So the public transit is running counter to all the other traffic in these giant one-ways. And before I read this one, I'd just like to say thank you again to Charles, everyone at Philly Cam, and to Larry Robin at Moonstone, and for all of you who are tuning in. This one's called Viewmaster Virtual Reality Starter Pack, Mortality Reel. 1. A canyon of memory floods as the zip line slips. First bike, first dance, first kiss, broken bone, and more. First love, wedding cake, 2 kids, soft spot pulsing on each newborn's crown. And you, in the blur of greenery and river and craggy rock, you release every spring, pulley, or counterweight that ever held you back. 2. Slammed by a pat bus, mercy, swift and painless. 7 angels gasp, but you are unperturbed, descending with a steaming non-fat chai tea latte into the counterflow lane from the curb. 3. One moment you leap and dance amid a snow-topped mountain cap backdrop, and the next, without notice, you huddle in bed, doting spouse dropping one perfect tear upon your furrowed brow. Somewhere afar, a sitar twangs and wails, a mysterious virus, rare injury, lightning seizing your whole and healthy spine when you least expect it. No choreography for grief. An entire troupe of sequined mourners, it seems, will fail to bring you back. 4. Legs crossed upon a mat in the dusty outpost, you attain such enlightenment that time slows, giving you full minutes to regard the smooth cartridge hurtling toward your chest. It makes of the air a gel, a web, a balloon stretched to snap. Welcome to bullet time. You were never so much in your life as you were around it, observing it, remarking on it. From this moment of given this moment of dead time, you can at last see from every given viewpoint. 5. Overpriced vintage fountain pen pokes through your bag, piercing your backside. Infection follows and you fall to sepsis, bringing credence to claims that daily writing involves risk. 6. Pitch darkness, silence, pure emptiness, a familiar voice in the distance. 7. The truth is, you don't see it coming even there in the wrinkled bed for the 6th, or is it 7th, visit that season. Your beloved covers a bowl of canned peaches, the only taste nowadays that appeals. You want to save it. You plan to eat it later. You wait for your children to arrive at the bedside as they always do, exhausted and deeply happy to see you still there, still alive, bright-eyed, but they know, shrinking. Your face is fuller now with fluids your kidneys retain, which helps everyone forget that your legs, under a stack of sheets and blankets, are nearly fleshless. You know the doctors by name, and they you. You know which nurses will glide in to usher each dumbstruck family member from the room hours after you've passed to the next world. Hours they've spent sobbing, wondering, and pleading. Your chest still rising and falling in rhythm endlessly, it seems, as though the only barrier between you and them were the blissful sleep of recovery, a dream of being lifted with love and carried home. Thank you.
Wow, that is such a beautiful selection of poems that you read. I would ask you, as we're kind of leaving, where are you now? I mean, is there a project that you're now? The next thing for Dilruba that you're working on, or is there an event coming up? With your current work that we might want to know about.
Yeah, thank you for asking. There are definitely new poems in the works. They're still new enough that there's nothing sort of there aren't any broad statements to make about them yet, but there are certainly new ones on the way. I'm continuing to experiment with different formal aspects and finding inspiration in the work of amazing poets, Rick Barrett, Ilya Kaminsky, Claudia Rankin, and Harriet Mullen, whose work I really admire. And in terms of events, there are some listed on my website, and I'll just note that coming up, there's a reading with the Living on Luck series, which is a local series here in Delaware County, and I'll also be doing a session of On the Stoop with Blue Stoop here in Philly, which has been doing great things for writers, and we'll talk about a piece from Jericho Brown's book, The Tradition, and that's in partnership with the One Book, One Philadelphia organization. So I'm really excited about those and hope to see a lot of people there.
So it's been great having you once again. Bring Now the Angels, Dilruba Ahmed. It's a wonderful book. You can buy it on Amazon or wherever. And you, of course, can go to Ruba's website. So I want to thank Dilruba for being a guest. I've for a long time wanted to have her back. I hosted her close to 7 years ago at Fergie's when her baby was pretty young and her husband was there, and we had a wonderful time that evening. So it's great to have you back, and it's great to have this this piece of work. And so much thanks to Philly Cab, and especially to Sergio Galano, who makes this all happen technically and is so patient with me, who is a nervous Nelly all the time. But I really appreciate all the work that he puts into it. The other thing, as I've always said, here's Moonstone. Here is another fantastic treasured poet that Moonstone has sponsored and that people get to listen to. And there's so many. Moonstone on an annual basis, and this is Larry. We sponsor, and we're still sponsoring virtually close to 85 to 90 poetry events a year. For example, on this weekend, because Larry's going out further than the United States, we're going to have poets from Eastern Europe, in a virtual reading on Sunday. And there's just so much that he is putting together that's so very interesting. I mean, there's a definite advantage to virtual, that you can reach out much further and bring more people, to Philadelphia in these poetry readings. So I say about Moonstone, I said before, Larry has put so much into this, but people take it for granted that, this is always going to be. We need your help and we need your support to continue to provide not only this program, but all the programs we publish. And I mean, last month I had an anthology. There's going to be another anthology that is coming out very soon. So we need your support. So go to Moonstone Arts Center .org and make a contribution. And maybe it's not a contribution, let's say financially, but maybe you want to be interested in helping us because of the talent that you have. And you can reach out to Larry, through that website, and say, I have an interest, I have a talent I think I could share with you. And I think that we need that also. But once again, Dilruba, thank you very much. A very enjoyable evening, a great discussion, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much, Larry. I really appreciate being here, and I'm grateful for your thoughtful reading of my book.